You're listening to In the Fast Lane. This is episode number 11 of the official podcast of the Australian Grand Prix. My name is Matt Clayton, and this week we're going to catch up with the Chief Executive Officer of the McLaren Formula One team, Zak Brown. All eyes were on Italy last weekend, with F1 making its debut at Mugello for the Tuscan Grand Prix, while we had another quite remarkable MotoGP race a couple of hundred kilometres away at Misano, where Yamaha's Franco Morbidelli became the fifth winner in 6 races this year, and the fourth rider after Fabio Quartararo, Brad Binder and Miguel Oliveira to take home a maiden Premier Class win in a season that just keeps on giving. Joining Morbidelli on the rostrum was fellow Italian Pecco Bagnaia of Ducati in second, his first career podium, while Joan Mir squeezed past Valentino Rossi on the final lap to round out the podium for Suzuki. Ducati's Andrea Dovizioso took over the lead in the championship despite finishing just 7th after a crash for Quartararo, while speaking of Ducati, Australia's Jack Miller was 8th after running inside the top 3 for the first half of the race. A shame for Jack, but he's still in 3rd place in the standings and just 12 points off Dovizioso in top spot. Remarkably, the top 12 in the title chase are within 36 points, and 12 different riders have already been on the podium in 6 races. It really has been an extraordinary two-wheel season so far. But back to four wheels, and Ferrari celebrated its 1000th Grand Prix as a team with a race at Mugello for the first time, and it certainly didn't disappoint. Off track, the biggest Ferrari-related story came before anyone had even turned a wheel at Mugello, with the announcement that Sebastian Vettel had signed with Racing Point for next season, where it will compete as Aston Martin. That's a big boost for that team to have a 4-time world champion on its books for the first year of a new name in Formula One. The Vettel signing was bad news for Sergio Perez, but fortunately for our resident Sergio Perez lookalike, my podcast teammate didn't receive a call from my dad to tell him his services were no longer required. It's hello to Michael Lemonato.
Yes, good. I get on perfectly fine with your dad, so I'm racing for his team again next year. I like that you said Ferrari celebrated its 1000th Grand Prix, because I think they're almost the team least likely to have celebrated a result in which they almost didn't score any points in this race.
I could have said commiserated there, couldn't I? But well, look back at Mugello as a standard race for this era of Formula One, in that we had a Mercedes 1-2 with Valtteri Bottas not quite being able to keep up with Lewis Hamilton when it mattered again, and a Red Bull occupying the other spot on the podium. But this was about 4 races for the price of one. I mean, it went for 2 hours and 19 minutes from when the lights went out the first time. Without taking quite that long to unpick it, Michael, take us through how we got to a podium that featured Hamilton, Bottas, and no, not Max Verstappen, but Alexander Albon for Red Bull once we got to the end of 59 pretty breathless laps.
Yeah, it almost sounds unremarkable, the headline result, doesn't it? 2 Mercedes in a Red Bull racing car on the podium. But you've got to feel, first of all, a little bit for Valtteri Bottas, because at this new track for Formula One at Mugello, he seemed like he had the upper hand for much of it. Didn't quite get pole, ran Hamilton very close, and then lost his final lap to a yellow flag in qualifying, but did enough off the line at the first of 3 starts in this Grand Prix to get Hamilton. But unfortunately, as luck would have it for Bottas, I suppose, of course, it's not all luck that has him 55 points down in the championship, but it was a little bit in this case. Didn't get a great start the second time round. Hamilton was able to slipstream him into the lead, and Hamilton never relinquished it from there. That was the race result done in terms of the battle for Mercedes. But behind Mercedes, where all the action was actually happening, Alex Albon managed to get onto the podium despite losing places at every red flag restart. Had to claw them all back in the way we sort of know and have come to love, I guess, of Albon, isn't it? Because he's really decisive once the race has started, and he's lost those places off the line. Some aggressive overtaking, most memorably, of course, against Australia's Daniel Ricciardo in the last stanza of the race when they were both on soft tyres. A beautiful move around the outside of the first lap, first turn. Not a lot Ricciardo could have done to defend. Albon just had the faster car at that point in the race, and finally got his first podium after about a year of asking.
You mentioned 3 starts. He certainly had lots of practice. Let's go back to the first of those red flags, where we had the rolling restart behind the safety car after the first lap incident. We had this dramatic accident that saw Carlos Sainz, Antonio Giovinazzi, Nicholas Latifi and Kevin Magnussen all eliminated, with Valtteri Bottas taking a very slow approach to restart the race. How did you see that incident? Because we saw afterwards 12 of the 20 drivers were actually spoken to by the stewards and questioned for their actions, so it was easier to list who wasn't. But Do you see that as just a quirk of a rolling restart at a circuit with a very, very long front straight with potential to pass? A little bit like Azerbaijan was a couple of years ago, where the restart to that race was a bit manic. Was it just a circumstance of that track, or is there a wider issue with these rolling restarts?
Yeah, definitely hallmarks of that kind of restart. It's come down to a couple of different things. Partly that the safety car now essentially leaves the field a little bit later, and this is an attempt to make sure the leader can't get a big advantage, way before the start-finish straight when no one's allowed to overtake and sprint off into the lead. It's designed to create a bit more action. We've got a lot more than probably was bargained for. But that aside, because I don't think Valtteri Bottas can really be blamed here. He didn't alter his speed. He really left it to the very last second to go to try and avoid being slipstreamed by Hamilton, but that's fair enough. What really ended up happening was in the middle of the field, and it looks like George Russell kind of started this, wanted to leave a big gap coming onto the start-finish straight so that he could floor it and not lose momentum once the race started going. But he floored it too soon. He preempted Bottas going quicker than he did, and ultimately had to hit the brakes, and then everyone behind him did the same. The first crash was between Giovinazzi and Magnussen, and then Giovinazzi hit Latifi, who'd actually managed to avoid the crash at first, but got cleaned up anyway, and then Sainz joined in, and real carnage. So there might be some reflection on this in terms of maybe if the safety car rule needs to be tweaked a little bit, I think, but it's partly a result of this circuit, the specific circumstances. Drivers may be expecting something that wasn't going to happen. Maybe it really does just come down to the drivers, then you'd be a bit more responsible in this situation. But it is racing at the end of the day. You got to go with your gut instinct a little bit. So probably 12 warnings was the right result, I think. I don't know if you can necessarily blame one person completely.
No, it definitely was a bit of a domino effect with that incident. You mentioned Daniel Ricciardo before. He ended up finishing fourth for Renault, so close to that maiden podium for that team again. Do you think he could have held on to third place, which he was in when Lance Stroll crashed on lap 43 and caused that second red flag? Do you think had that race had stayed as it was to the end, those last 16 laps, could we have seen him on the rostrum?
Would have been interesting to see, because one thing we didn't get out of this race was the strategic element, if you like, managing the tyres. I know it sounds very boring, but it's part of Formula One. You've been watching it for this long, you should know. And Ricciardo seemed to be doing really well on his tyres in the middle part of the race, on those medium tyres. Seemed to have a lot in reserve as well, anticipating that Albon would be coming back through the field as he was before Lance Stroll crashed and sort of reset the race. With everyone on soft tyres, starting right next to each other, Ricciardo and Albon as well. The Red Bull racing car was ultimately just the quicker one. It seemed inevitable, eventually that he was going to get past. The DRS was about right at this track. There are opportunities to overtake, as we learned at Mugello. How good is that? So there wasn't a lot he could do to defend, but it would have been fascinating to see, a battle given the fullness of the race, had there not been that second red flag. And you wouldn't put it past Ricciardo being able to defend in those circumstances. And I did like after the race, he said he's never seen a man more happy at the potential of getting a tattoo as Cyril Abitbol is now. I think he's come round to the idea that he might have one by the end of the year, and he's anticipating it. He's excited for it.
Renault's certainly in a better place for Cyril to visit the tattoo parlour than they were certainly earlier on in the season. But we mentioned Ferrari's 1000th race before. Featured 5 points, 4 for Charles Leclerc finishing 8th and 1 for Sebastian Vettel in 10th. Not a great result, but that is 5 points more than they scored at Spa and Monza, mind you. Ferrari's 6th in the constructors' standings, and they're barely the best Italian team with AlphaTauri close behind. But I guess Ferrari having its 1000th race, that and obviously COVID this year, has meant that Formula One and Mugello in the same sentence, something I've wanted for so long. It did not disappoint this circuit, particularly the second sector with all of the evocative corner names, if you bothered to learn them in Italian, of course. Absolutely spectacular, and seeing these cars at their limit. You're probably less familiar with this circuit than I am, but I did talk it up for a few weeks beforehand. How did you find it?
Yeah, well, the talking up was worthwhile, I think, because it was a spectacular setting, first of all, and and I know this word gets sort of thrown around quite a bit in motorsport generally, but it really applies here. Old school circuit in all of the right ways, which is that it's flowing, had interesting elevation, had interesting camber that played quite a big part as well in terms of making it really raceable. And of course the gravel, no one wants to see cars, let's say, have big crashes, but the gravel means if you make mistakes, you are punished for it, and you don't always get a second chance, which means it's really up to the driver to decide how much risk they want to take. And that makes racing, I think that can't be underestimated in terms of creating pace differentials in the field that that generates good racing in a formula that sometimes makes racing a little bit difficult. It'd be great to think we could come back here one day and have a more, let's say, regular race without so much interruption to see how that goes down. Not sure how likely that is, but I think having seen it and having seen how excited the drivers and the teams were to be there as well, I think that has a big effect. I wouldn't rule it out, not completely. And look, it might be the only way Ferrari can get a win in the next couple of years is to say that their track hosted a good race, because I don't think that car's going to be winning anytime soon.
It's very true. Look, I think it's only fair. If we can't have Suzuka this year, if we can't have the best circuit in Formula One, let's have a pretty able replacement in Mugello. But what that was, it was the 9th race in 11 weekends, so everyone has been incredibly busy since the season restarted. Russia next up on the calendar in a couple of weeks' time. But as exciting as that Mugello F1 race was, it was in Formula 3 where we had the biggest reason to get excited on Sunday when Melbourne-born Oscar Piastri came home 7th in a dramatic season finale to win the title by just 3 points. We'll be catching up for a long chat with Oscar about what he hopes is an eventual pathway to Formula One in the coming weeks. But for now, it's time to introduce this week's special guest. Joining us on this week's episode of In the Fast Lane is the CEO of one of the sport's most famous teams, a team that is built on a strong 2019 with an even better campaign this season. From McLaren Racing, it's a warm welcome to Zach Brown. Hey, Zach.
How are you?
Going well, thank you. Your team also going pretty well, you would have to say. 2020 really looks like a step in the right direction for McLaren after last year. Is the team hitting all those on-track benchmarks that you had expected this season, or perhaps exceeded them a little bit?
No, I would say we're kind of on course for our desired race results this year. Obviously, you're going to have some good races and bad races along the way. But, you know, our goal being 4th in the championship last year was to at least be 4th in the championship and close the gap to the front. And so far, about halfway through the season, we seem to be doing that, but there's still a lot of racing to go and a very close fight in mid-pack. So we got to keep our head down and keep pushing.
Obviously, the restructuring and the reorganisation of the team had been aimed at being the best placed for 2021 and the rule changes. That's obviously been put on hold for an extra year because of COVID. But might that extra year of development for you guys and understanding of this car and for the team to gel actually help you maximise that big shot that everybody has in 22, but particularly McLaren as it tries to move further forward?
Yeah, I do think the rule change and delay, if you'd like, work to our benefit for kind of, I would say, 2 reasons. One, the budget cap gets kicked in, so now the new car everyone has to develop has to be developed under the budget cap, where had it debuted in 21, you spend so much money the previous year that those with unlimited budgets would have been able to outspend everyone and get a really big head start. The other is, there'll be learnings with Mercedes as there were with Renault, always in year one, how the engine works, packaging, cooling, things of that nature. So to kind of have a car that we know that we can then put the Mercedes in, I think we'll understand the power unit quicker than if you were also moving to a new power unit and changing a car. You're kind of having to learn a lot at once. So I think given that we're one of the only teams, or probably the only team changing power units, and we can now develop our 2022 car with the same budget as others, I think means we'll just be on a more equal footing.
One of the quirks, I suppose you could call it a positive quirk of these delayed rules, I suppose, is, as you touched on, the cost cap coming in a year in advance of those regulation changes more broadly. We've read in the last couple of weeks that Mercedes, as an example of one of the big teams, has spent essentially triple what the cost cap is going to be, as a rough kind of ballpark figure. Can you explain just how big a difference those cost controls are going to make to an independent team like McLaren? And is it all down to that spending when we're looking at perhaps a levelling of performance in 2022? Or what other things do you think are going to make a difference for your team?
Well, I think that'll be the single largest difference, because we're getting outspent, 5-3 by Mercedes, Ferrari, and quite a margin to Red Bull. So I think it just means that we're all going to be competing with similar resources, and so it's the good old phrase of "May the best man win, may the best team win," and that's all we're looking for is a fair fight, an equal fight, and then I think it's going to be very competitive, and also we can't underestimate that while we're chasing the 3 teams or 2 teams that are in front of us currently, there's a couple teams behind us that also are going to be able to run at the budget cap that are great teams. So I think the real winner in this are going to be race fans, because you're going to go from, 2 teams that can currently win to, maybe we'll double, triple that, and you'll see 5 or 6 teams that can win. And I think that'll just be much more exciting for Formula One fans.
No one's going to argue with that. Changing tack a little bit, Formula One, part of the sport is stories of, backroom dealings in the Piranha Club and all that kind of thing. So I think some fans were probably a bit surprised to hear that when Carlos Sainz announced he was going to be leaving your team, he'd asked your permission, and perhaps even more surprised that you'd said yes and allowed him to enter negotiations and ultimately leave for Ferrari. How important is that kind of cultural openness in rebuilding McLaren, in having this business operating the way it is? And I guess talking about Sainz more specifically, how key has he been to this process of building up the team?
Yeah, our Carlos has been a fantastic addition to our team. We've got a great relationship. We had the ability to stop him from going to another team. But, we've always wanted Daniel Ricciardo, and tried to get him in our team a couple of years ago. And it was one of those where the stars aligned. Carlos had a desire to race for Ferrari, which is totally understandable. When I grew up watching Formula One, I happened to be a McLaren guy, but you were kind of either a McLaren guy or a Ferrari guy. So totally understand that. We obviously would have only allowed that if we felt we could get someone of Daniel's ability, and someone that we wanted a couple of years ago. And so we said, why don't you go explore, and we'll explore. And if you get the opportunity and we can get a 7-time Grand Prix winner, then, hey, that's going to work out well for all of us. And so I think I'm quite proud, if you look at the driver changes at Ferrari and now at Racing Point and even at Renault, there weren't a lot of congratulatory notes going back and forth between the drivers and the team bosses. And yet, Carlos made a very emotional, which was great, video. We're having a great season together. We're both thinking about, the race tomorrow, so to speak, and, not thinking yet about 21. And so it's kind of a fairy tale ending, if you'd like, to a great couple of years together, but we still have a lot of racing to do. And I think his maturity and his relationship with Lando helped bring Lando along. And I think we got a great driver lineup, and I think it's only going to be stronger with Daniel and Lando.
Zach, you mentioned Daniel, and a couple of years ago, he obviously spoke to you guys when he was looking to leave Red Bull before ultimately deciding on Renault. A 2-part question. What do you feel that McLaren demonstrated him this time that perhaps you couldn't a couple of years ago in convincing him to sign on? And relating to that, how critical was Andreas Seidel's role in getting Daniel on board? I know Daniel was standing outside on the farm trying to get some phone reception, speaking to Andreas a little bit when everyone was locked down. But, Daniel came close a couple of years ago. What got him over the line this time?
Well, a couple of years ago, we were coming off a horrific season, one of our worst in McLaren history. And really all I could do at that point was promise or make claims, if you'd like, to Daniel on what my intentions were. But at that point, it's just words. I'm going to get a great team principal. I'm going to get a great technical director. We're going to get the resources we need. We're going to invest in CapEx. So it was a lot of promises. And I think, understandably, he went, all sounds good. but you are coming off one of the worst seasons in McLaren's history. And I think ultimately, didn't get him over the line for those reasons. I think a year later, we have a very strong season. Now I can say, instead of saying I'm going to get a great team principal, I can say I've got Andreas Seidel, who I think is making a huge difference in the team. I'm going to get a great technical director. I got one, James Key. And so I think a year on, he was able to see I kind of put my money where my mouth was, so to speak, and the results were coming. And he's a huge Andreas fan. I think that had a big part in his decision-making progress. As he says, Andreas is a monster. And I think he means that in a good way. And okay, so Andreas can now hear me in the other room. So he liked that. I think that's ultimately why he made the decision this time around.
One of the strong signs so far this season, of course, was the result of the Italian Grand Prix at Monza a couple of weeks ago. But since then, the idea of reverse grids has sort of been raised again in debate, a little bit with an eye to the change in regulations over the next couple of years. There was, generating the right circumstances for overtaking in this high downforce era is pretty difficult. Is something like reverse grids to generate those conditions something F1 should explore in the next couple of seasons? Or would a result like the Italian Grand Prix, for example, where your car was just outright second quickest, be somehow a bit cheapened if those circumstances were manufactured, do you think?
Yeah, I don't think reverse grids are necessary, because I think when we get Formula One on a more equal playing field in 22, as long as we get it right with the technical rules and it's much closer, that should naturally happen. The field should get much closer, and therefore, like you see in other forms of racing, like IndyCar racing, you get many more mixed grids because the grids are much closer. So we're not fans of reverse grids or anything that's not genuine, if you'd like, or authentic to race pace. But the good news is I think that's going to naturally happen with a closer field.
Zach, did want to ask you about Fernando Alonso. You've obviously got the long relationship with him now, both in F1 and obviously his quest to achieve that Triple Crown at Indianapolis. Obviously coming back next year with Alpine. I have to keep remembering to say Alpine and not Renault. Are you surprised he's jumped back in with a team that isn't yet in race-winning contention? And what do you think that team is going to be gaining with a hungry Fernando Alonso in the cockpit?
Well, I think Fernando's as talented as you get. So, and he's extremely experienced. So I think what they're going to get is a driver that they know is very committed, very experienced, knows what it takes to win. So as they continue to develop their car, much like we have with Daniel, because Carlos and Lando haven't won a race yet. So at the end of the day, until you get someone in your car that can win races, and I have no doubt that Lando and Carlos can, but they haven't. So as you look to take variables out, Renault knows exactly where their car is because Daniel Ricciardo will drive it as fast as it's capable of going. That'll be the same situation with Fernando. So I think it'll be a big benefit to, as you say, Alpine.
Zach, really been great to catch up with you and get your take on any number of topics. There's a number of things that we've kicked around tonight, which has been terrific. Certainly a lot of McLaren fans in Australia enjoying the team's resurgence this year, and I suspect you might sell a few orange caps at Albert Park next year too, just quietly. Look, really appreciate the time. Thanks so much for joining us on the podcast, and all the best for the remainder of the season.
Thank you very much, and look forward to seeing you next year.
That's all for this episode of In the Fast Lane. Thanks for joining us, and a big thanks to this week's guest, Zach Brown. We'll be back next week to wrap up everything that happens at the second MotoGP weekend at Misano, and we'll also be joined by one of the rising young stars of the sport for an extensive interview. Until then, for Michael Lemonato, I'm Matt Clayton. Join us next time for another lap in the Fast Lane.